I'm going to be covering the actually not the most well known, but the first Animals album. And this is the Animals, the original version, not the later version that was Eric Burden and the Animals. And this one is sort of a shout out to my father. This was my father's first favorite band as a kid when he was 8 years old. And when he found out that I was doing a podcast and we were starting in the 60s, he did ask me when we were going to be covering the Animals and what I thought of them. And I told him, unfortunately, they did not make the best ever albums top 100 countdown, which he was both outraged and disappointed about. But now, though, that we're cleaning the stacks, this one will be to some degree a dedication to my dad, who has in many ways pointed me into the various different types of music that I've listened to. So thanks, Dad. Uh,
Influencers are important and worth mentioning, even outside of just the bands. People in our lives who introduce us to stuff can go a long way for sure. So it's worth mentioning for sure.
No doubt. And I think in terms of a smooth transition, the Animals were also incredibly influential to many, many artists. And before we get into the bio a little bit, let me pull a couple quotes about the Animals, Matt, if you'll so indulge me,
Do it.
because I did think it was interesting. One of your favorite bands, Genesis, Tony Banks of Genesis, he
Oh
is the
yeah.
keyboardist, was highly influenced by the first keyboardist of the Animals, who we're going to talk
Okay.
about quite a bit for other reasons. But he said that much of his work initially started with Alan Price's keyboard playing. So he was influenced
Interesting.
there. Yep.
I
Uh,
did not know that.
Bob Dylan, someone we've covered, has said that
Mhm.
when he heard the Animals version of House of the Rising Sun, that it was the track that made him think about going electric. And unlike many of the stories that kind of are thought of as apocryphal or just not real, this one has actually been confirmed. Because Bob Dylan did record that song in 1962 before them, but he heard that and thought, I might want to go electric after that. So
Yeah.
that's a pretty big piece of music trivia right there.
Yeah.
And Bruce Springsteen, who is a noted Animals fan, and much like my father is a scion of New Jersey, he said that about the Animals, he said, that's every song I've ever written. That's Born to Run, Born in the USA, everything I've done over the last 40 years, including all the new ones. They struck me so deep. It was the first time I felt I heard something come across the radio that mirrored my home life and my childhood. And he even said that Darkness on the Edge of Town was basically an album that every song was influenced by the Animals. So right off the bat, there's three pretty well known artists talking about the love of the Animals and the effect they had on them. What are your
John,
thoughts?
If I didn't know any better, I would say that you've cherry picked those three artists as because they're pretty much three of my favorites. I could probably say that they would encapsulate three of my top 10.
Oh,
So
you know me all too well, Matt, because there are other people that have said that the Animals were influential. In fact, they're largely considered the second most influential uh, British invasion band with a blues, rhythm and blues take on things, along with the Stones.
right.
And many people think that along with the Beatles and the Kinks, they sort of represent the big four in terms of bands that came over. But they probably actually get talked about less than the other four, I would think. But they're no less influential. So, but yes, I specifically picked three artists that I know resonate deeply with Matt right there to try to build the case.
Well,
So are
that's a
you
good
ready?
start. That's a good
There,
start.
there we go. So do we want to dig a tiny bit into the Animals here for a little bit of context? Because we don't have to go too long because this is their first album. We'll give maybe a little bit of background afterwards, but from the time that they're signed until the time they release this album is not very long at all. So the basics on the Animals. They were a band that was founded in Newcastle, England, and then moved to London in 1964, basically right as Beatlemania was going on. Now, one thing that is going to come up pretty quickly when you listen to the Animals, even though they're in that British invasion period, is they are more Rolling Stones than they are Beatles or Kinks. In the sense that, as I talked about earlier, they're going to take the blues songs, the covers, basically the template that the Beatles and the Stones were using at this time, and they were going to take it in a specifically bluesy direction. As someone said in the research I did, they're very much the B of the R&B in terms of their take, and that's a little bit different than the Beatles, and you definitely can see on this album and I don't want to get into it too much because I'm sure Matt will have a lot to say, but we covered With the Beatles from 1963, and they were doing a lot of the same material in terms of the artists they were covering, but man, the Animals did it differently than the Beatles. Would you not say, Matt?
Yeah, definitely. The bluesy element is certainly there, much more so than what the Beatles were doing.
Gotcha. The original lineup, probably the most well-known member of the Animals, and the only one who was in both versions of it, was Eric Burdon, who was the pretty easy to recognize vocalist of the group. Alan Price, who only lasted till 1965, and boy, it's quite a story as to why that happened. He's on the organ and the keys. John Steele's on the drums. He would be there till 1966 when he would leave the band. Brian Chaz, excuse me, 1965. I apologize. Brian Chandler is on the bass, and Hilton Valentine is on the guitar. And both of them
Hilton
would
Valentine?
Hilton Valentine,
What a
another
great name.
fantastic 60s names that would be like out of Almost Famous, you know what I mean? Or
Is that
something.
his birth name? Or is
That
that sounds
as
made
far
up?
as I know, it is his birth name, and unlike Mr. Brian Chandler, who went by Chaz and had a nickname, I did not see any shorthand for Hilton Valentine. So it appears, and certainly anyone listening who may know any differently can let me know, but it appears that was the birth name. And man, if you're going to have a guitarist, Hilton Valentine,
Yeah.
about as good as it gets, right? It's like
Props to his parents, man. That's a great name.
yeah, it's sort of like in Boogie Nights, Dirk Diggler is the perfect porn name. You know, Hilton Valentine's kind of like the perfect lead guitarist name. Anyways, right up there with Ace Frehley, I think, another a great lead guitarist name. You know, so but anyway, so that is the initial band. Three of the members, Burden, Chandler, and Valentine, would be there throughout what's affectionately known as Animals 1 before Animals 2. That's the Eric Burden and the Animals version of it came about. Like I said, Alan Price would leave the earliest, and the story of him leaving is a big piece of the band's history, and John Steele would be there till 1965. So they were a successful live band when they moved to London, and they got signed pretty quickly. They signed with Columbia. They released a single only a couple months after doing that called Baby Let Me Follow You Down. It got changed into Baby Let Me Take You Home. I'm not sure why, because it seems no less scandalous either way. You know, Baby Let Me Follow You Down or Baby Let Me Take You Home. Both are kind of talking about the same thing. But it was changed, and this was followed by one of their two most well-known tracks, House of the Rising Sun. Now, Matt, how familiar were you with the Animals heading into this listen?
Well, certainly with the House of the Rising Sun, and that's been a song that I've liked for many, many years. Eric Burden's voice on that is just killer, right? The way he's just belting out, you know, and his kind of raspy, you know, his voice. I've always liked that. So that's been and I remember when I first heard that years ago, you know, thinking that's a band that I would like to learn more about because it's so great. And I never really did. I never really followed, well, you know, through with that. It's, you know, before the age of Spotify. So I didn't, you know, I never went out and bought an album, right? And never
So
got to that point.
why do you think, out of curiosity, Matt, that you followed the Beatles down the rabbit hole, but not
Yep.
the Animals?
Well, probably because the Beatles were more omnipresent in my life, and they were,
Okay.
you know, a band that I heard from various members of my family, and you know, it was just way more on my radar. So, yeah, and that's probably just what happened there. But nobody came up to me in my, you know, in high school or anything, really touting the Animals, and you need to listen to this record. So that was probably a big reason for it. But I did know the House of the Rising Sun, but not a whole lot. I'm somewhat familiar with Eric Burden.
You got to get out of this place. You probably stumbled across that at some point, didn't
Yes.
you?
Oh,
Yeah.
yes, I did know that song. Right, I forgot about that. Yep. And there's probably other songs that I knew too, but they've never been a band that has been, you know, fully on my radar, or a band that I really knew a whole lot about. So so it was cool. I liked kind of getting to know this record.
Well, and one thing to know is that there are two versions of this album. There's the US version, which came out first, and then the UK version. Only 7 tracks are shared. So there's considerable difference between the US and the UK albums. You know, most of the time, the albums are similar when record labels did that, especially during this time period. There are examples in history that The Clash comes to mind of, you know, a fair amount of differences between the US and the UK version, but this was almost two different albums. So the version on Spotify that I think both of us worked off of is the US version and features House of the Rising Sun. The UK version actually did not have that on it.
Wow.
And the UK version did not have Blue Feeling on it as well, which became sort of like a holy grail type of deal because the US version was not easy to get in England from everything I read. So there were a lot of people combing the stacks, so to speak, in England for the US version because that version of Blue Feeling was considered to be a white whale for fans of the
And
Animals. Yeah.
yeah, and that goes back to what we were talking about with with the Beatles and Meet the Beatles. You know how they
Mm-hmm.
released one, kind of version on in the UK and then another one in the US. It's
Or the
interesting.
Stones as well did that quite a bit.
Yeah, well, and probably a lot of bands did it too. And I think we touched upon this a little bit in that episode we talked about with the Beatles. Not being sure exactly why those decisions were made, like how you keep the House of the Rising Sun off of this album. It would be interesting to know the reasoning behind that, and I don't know if you know that, or if there's any details on it, but or if that's readily available information. But I find that fascinating, and I also find it interesting that this is a British band and they released the album in the US before
Yep.
they did the UK, which is the opposite of what the Beatles did. So
Wait,
again, why is that? What were they?
well,
Did they?
I take a guess on the US UK one, and that's because in 1964, when this album was released, the Beatles were going to America and were it was right during the period, right, where Beatlemania was hitting
Well,
America.
the Beatles
And
went to America in April of '64, and this was released in September of '64, if I'm not mistaken. So
and
that,
that's my guess is that they saw the evidence, the United States is larger than Great Britain, and I'm
yep.
thinking that maybe they thought strike while the iron is hot is
Mm-hmm.
what my guess is on that. And so yeah.
Yeah, that would make sense. That would make sense.
Yeah. And so I don't know that for sure, but that's the only thing I can think of in terms of that. Now, much like many of these things, House of the Rising Sun did become available later on UK versions of it once the song was uh, went on to be a hit. And so it was only the earliest versions of it that did not have it on it in terms of the research that I did. So so it wasn't a long-term decision like other things. They reprinted it and added stuff along with it. So we've done a lot of bio. There's a lot more interesting about the bio, which I'll try to weave in, but I kind of want to go over before I get into more bio, Matt, and I kind of
Yeah.
want to start into the review a little bit. What did you think of this album? Because this is a formative album. It is not considered their greatest piece of work, and some people don't feel that this is as strong as Eric Burdon and the Animals, but it is considered an incredibly influential album. And when I say not considered greatest, doesn't mean it's not considered a good album. It's just not, the big album that you glam onto from the Animals. But it's the first, and it definitely represents a huge piece of the British invasion. What are your thoughts?
So my initial thought listening to this, like I said, I knew House of the Rising Sun, but I didn't know any other songs of the versions of the songs that they did on this album when I first listened to it. I was surprised well, initially I was thinking, oh, okay, well, I knew the second track, The Girl Can't Help It, is a cover, right?
Yep.
I
In fact,
knew
every song on this is a cover with the
that's,
exception of one song. Yep.
what's that song? What,
So it's interesting. The song that is not a cover is actually on the UK version of it. I'm Crying. On
okay.
this one, every song is a cover.
That's
Yes.
okay. So
Yep.
that's where I was going because I was surprised, of the songs that it's at the right time. That was a song that I knew from,
Mhm.
well, the Cosby Show, and that's what first came to my mind. That iconic scene in the Cosby Show where they're all
Wow.
singing the
Yes.
song.
Hmm.
But I knew that I think Ray Charles did a version of that as
Yep.
well, and so I was just surprised early on at doing a cold listen that there were so many covers. And then as I read later on, I'm like, geez, every song is a cover.
Yep.
So I was surprised at that and a little disappointed. I think that the covers on here are great for the most part. I did like the album, and it's just like you said, John, it's straight up blues. Most of these songs I could easily just substitute these guys for the Stones, and I could see them doing the same type of thing exactly. So I was
Really?
just
You say exactly, huh? Because to me, while they're both coming at it from that R&B and especially blues approach, they're very different sounding
well,
to
I think
my
I
ears.
mean exactly in terms of the overall sound, I could easily see the Stones doing that song in a very similar way. Not every song. There was a couple that I felt as I listened to it more, I'm like, yeah, I could totally see the Stones doing this. But I guess that was my main takeaway initially, was being surprised that they were all covers, and then just wondering if this was something that they would continue with, or if they started branching out and becoming, more songwriting themselves.
It was not, and it's. We talked about how the bio is going to weave itself in, Matt, and here's the first example where that's going to happen. So, long story short, in May of 1965, Alan Price, the keyboardist, who, when you listen to this album, gives the group a distinctive sound, which we'll talk about in a second, I'm sure. But he left the band, and at the time they said it was a fear of flying, which is why he left the band, which seems to be something that comes up quite a bit in these 60s bands.
Like Gene Clark.
Yep.
And the Byrds.
Exactly. Gene Clark of the Byrds, same exact thing. And obviously flying in the 60s, I'm sure, was a very different endeavor on all fronts. When you think about flying in the 60s, right?
Pan Am those commercials of Pan Am, that always looked like a nice airline. I'm kind of bummed they went out of business.
I always think it more of like, how many times you'd read about planes being hijacked and then they just say ride with it, you know what I mean, into different stuff and no security. So, and obviously I think it was a little more, you take it and take your safety into your hands a little bit in the 60s, right? The flying experience compared to 2020, right? So I could see how someone, especially if they were having to, cross the Atlantic multiple times, might be a little bit trepidatious. But in this case, unlike Gene Clark, who pretty much everybody verifies, it was a real fear. A lot of things say that was sort of a cover reason for why he left, and here is why. Because when the track "We've Got to Get Out of This Place" was released, Alan Price left right at the height of when the band was, at one of their most successful points. And what was found out was that for House of the Rising Sun, the album could only fit one person as the person who arranged the track. So instead of it being a group arrangement or even just an arrangement based on who wrote the song, thinking of like, Lennon, McCartney, that type thing. Instead, they just picked one person's name to put on it. And in this case, it was Alan Price, who also, not coincidentally, had a background as an accountant and in finance. To say that this caused consternation between the group, since he reaped pretty much all of the royalties from this song, and the Animals basically broke up because they were broke.
Wait.
Yeah.
Okay, so they all arranged it, right? Technically.
So House of the Rising Sun is a long-standing song going back to the 40s, right? So it's been covered by a variety of people. A long legend was that, they got it from Bob Dylan, and while Bob Dylan did cover it in 1962, they don't consider that to be why they covered it. And actually Dylan and others agree. They think that their inspiration was Josh White, who was a blues singer in the 40s and 50s. That was the version that influenced them to record this, which actually makes sense when you look at what else they were covering on this album. He very much. Now it's also been covered by Bob Dylan and Nina Simone, but it's pretty clear that the version by Josh White was what caused them to record this.
And I'd probably make the argument, I'm just throwing this out there, that this version, the Animals version, is probably the most well-known version.
It is, by quite a bit. Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So they all arranged it, but because they couldn't fit it on the sleeve, Alan Price gets it, but that means he also gets the royalties. So
one person gets basically the credit as the arranger, right? The person which in that case was the writer, right? The royalties and stuff like that. That's why, Lennon and McCartney fought for a bazillion years, right? About like lead writing credits, and some groups collectivized their writing, like REM, right? Stuff like that. And others, it's a big deal. You know what I mean? Who gets the songwriter? I mean, we just covered the Byrds, right? And how many songs you got on the album and who wrote them was a big deal at all times with them. But anyway, the main thing with this was that at the time, they kind of considered themselves young and with a collective ethos, right? Well, we'll figure it out. And a lot of bands start that way, right? Then it goes sideways. But in this case, they were still at that idealistic stage. But apparently Alan Price was a little bit more with it in terms of savvy with what could be. So especially guitarist Valentine and Eric Burden were really resentful because the Animals are notoriously a band that, while a lot of bands lost their money, they were pretty grossly mismanaged to the point where they were left with nothing, to the point where the band basically broke up because they couldn't make a living despite the fact that they were this tremendous British invasion band. And so fast forward later, the original Animals have a brief 1968 renewal that no one's really into. They come back in 1976 and randomly release an album that's actually well received. It's one of the few albums of a band that kind of came back from the 60s and released a good album, unlike some of the other bands we've covered, right? Like
Yep.
Beach Boys and Birds and stuff like that, and reunions. And then, and even the Monkees, who we covered a couple episodes ago. And then they came back again in 1983 and did live shows. And I guess at that point, Burden kind of goes up to Price and says, "Hey, listen, we'll let bygones be bygones. Everything that's happened hasn't happened, but going forward, can we collectivize that song?" And basically, Alan Price told to take a hike, and that's the last. That's the last time anybody in the band talked to Mr. Price, and he's been persona non grata.
No kidding.
Ever since. Yeah, so there's quite a bit of hard feelings right there.
It would be one thing if he actually was the main arranger, or like the guy that took the helm. But if they really all did it, that's a jerk move.
Yeah, it was something else. So we're not there, and I'd like to give Mr. Price the ability to talk for himself. Although it is hard to find his take because he has basically kept a policy of not commenting on it throughout the years. So
you don't think if we invited him on our podcast, he would turn us down?
I think he might. Yeah, I know though that Eric Burden probably wouldn't, because he is very vocal about the fact that he feels that he was screwed.
Was the writing? So did they I would assume that more writing came later on after. This.
Yep. So that was a long depart into what happened was at the beginning of their career, they were having songs written for them and picked for them would be probably a better way to call it. Okay. So very long story short, but it kind of goes into how music was done in the 60s a lot of times. And actually kind of a similar story to what we covered with the Monkees a couple bonus tracks ago. So what happened was, and we're going back into the bio after I said we weren't going to, but hey, you know what? You asked, so we'll dig into it a little bit. So what happened was at the time, they were having songs picked for them by a gentleman by the name of Mickey Most. Okay, so Mickey Most was a guy who was sort of a record producer, and he was working along with a sort of a conglomerate, I guess, that would pick the songs, they would record them. And Eric Burden was chafing at this point and did not love having his tracks picked for them, definitely wanted to have a little bit more of a say in terms of what's going on. So Mickey Most and this Brill building of songwriters that are well known, and that worked with people like Herman's Hermits and Donovan, right? So they were, working out of that as well, having songs picked. So Burden decides he wants to be more creative. 1965 comes, and basically they end their association with Most. They end their association with Columbia Records. They head over to the American label MGM Records. They move to California, and they begin working with Tom Wilson, who gives them considerably more artistic freedom.
Gotcha.
And then basically collect all of their hits from the previous time, release a best of album called The Best of the Animals. Sells super well in the U.S., but then by that point, the band is basically done. And Eric Burden released a solo album and then creates a whole new band, which becomes Eric Burden and the Animals. And that's a band that's well known, starting with the album Animalism, which is probably their most well-regarded album, in November of 1966. And that version of the Animals lasts from 1966 to 1968. So there you go.
So that's
how that plays out.
And that's kind of, and I think I just find it interesting that everything was a cover, because I guess I was used to songs being peppered in, and this is, 64, late 64, you're a couple months away from 65 here. And the idea that these bands writing their own music was becoming more and more prominent. So I guess that was, surprising to me, but that didn't take away from the enjoyment overall. I think it was just kind of an initial surprise. But this is just a straight up great blues record, and like you said, I think that the keyboards really stand out. I think the band sounds really tight together. I thought that when you mentioned earlier, "Baby, Let Me Take You Home," I recognized that song as the Dylan. I knew Dylan's version, "Baby, Let Me
Mhm.
Follow You Home," and so but I was like, well, that's a different name of the title, and I think it's slightly different lyrics too. But and I read a little bit about it, and I was a little confused. I don't know if you shed any light on this, but essentially it was a cover for Dylan. Dylan didn't write it, but it was just different versions of the same song, which is not
Mhm.
really something that I've seen before. Usually, if people cover, the same song, it's the same lyrics, it's relatively, similar melodies, but this is, but this is just a different name or a different arrangement or whatever. So I thought that
Well,
that was kind of interesting.
in the 50s and 60s, there were there were there wasn't a lot of original music being written by artists. And I think that one of the reasons the Beatles become the Beatles, right, is because they begin writing their own songs and they transition into that. And like we talked about before, the Monkees were still kind of going off of the model, in 1966, 67, right? That was the model that existed all throughout the 50s and in the 1960s, right? Where there were professional songwriters, right? There were studio musicians. You might be a musician, but you'd bring in these studio musicians, your band would evolve. Professional songwriters wrote professional songs, kind of like how country music has operated for a very long time.
Yeah.
And that was what you did because, why it's hard enough to be an artist, right? To write and then compose and then write your own songs. Certain people are meant to play and certain people are meant to write, right? And so it's not unusual, even with bands such as the Stones and the Beatles, who ended up writing, and even the Kinks, who ended up writing a ton of their own stuff, to see both them all cover the same songs because there's just songs that were considered to be staple songs and that audiences wanted to hear.
Yeah.
And so that's why you see Dylan overlap with the Animals so much. That's why you see the same artists like Chuck Berry and Little
Fats
Richard
Domino.
and Fats Domino. Yep. And there's John Lee Hooker.
But it's just, but
yeah.
I find it interesting that I guess just that that there was just a different version of it,
Mm-hmm.
and just inspired by different writers and things like that. So,
But when you think about it, Dylan, that continues to be a thing for him throughout the 60s. We saw the Byrds covered him relentlessly.
yep.
Jimi Hendrix covered him. So, and even in the 70s, right? We talked about Bruce Springsteen earlier, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the Night comes to mind, right? A song that was written for someone else by Bruce Springsteen, in this case, Patti Smith.
Right.
So that's always existed. People having, Prince is another guy, right? Who wrote a ton of songs that he ended up not saying. Manic Monday by the Bangles,
Sure.
Nothing Compares to You, right? So it's not altogether uncommon, but yeah, I think that maybe you're thinking there might be some more originals, and the Animals definitely had that way. They had
yeah,
that
and
way.
I figured that, but I just didn't know how long it would take before they started doing that. So, I thought the money's
in live performances too, Matt.
Yeah.
And so if you're playing a bunch of your own shit and no one knows what your shit was,
right.
In the early 60s, that was a ticket to obscurity, I think.
Absolutely. No, that's very true. And I thought obviously, and another song that was kind of similar in that vein was "Talking About You," which is parts of "Shout," right? That song by the Isley Brothers, right? Which is just, and I'm like, oh, this is "Shout," but it's not "Shout." It's just parts of it in this song. So I think that that's kind of an interesting thing that was going on. It's like, let's take the framework of a song and change it up slightly, add something, take something away, but it's its own thing. Actually, and I felt that "Talking About You" and the next song, "Around and Around," they kind of sounded like gospel songs. I could see some Southern Baptist church choir going nuts in a church. Not so much the lyrical content, but more about like the feel of the music, clapping.
Well, that's Eric Burden's. That's Eric Burden's voice right there, and that's what stands out to me.
But it's
right?
more than just his voice, though. It's the clapping and it's the upbeat nature, and it just seems like I could see a group.
Well, the organ too.
Yeah,
the organ
right.
Too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, very true. No, I thought overall I really enjoyed it. There wasn't. I think the only song on here that maybe I was a little bit bored with, I just thought that "I'm Mad Again." I think it's the penultimate track on the album. Is I always like that word.
There you go.
It's a blues song. It's more spoken. It's kind of one of those blues songs that's not really sung. It's kind of just it's a much more spoken word kind of a song, and it seems like it's too long. I think it's almost 6 minutes, and it just seems,
Yeah.
I feel like you could cut that down. But I knew Memphis, Tennessee, the Chuck Berry song from
Hmm.
before. I've always liked that. Um,
Well, there's two Chuck Berry songs on the
mhm.
album. There's a John Lee Hooker one, a Fats Domino. It's like a greatest hits, right? A Ray Charles.
Yeah,
Basically, actually, there's two Fats Domino songs. Sorry, all the different people that you would expect
yeah, the heavy hitters
are
for
on here.
sure.
Yep.
But I
Hmm.
think if you wanted just to have someone's, hey, what's, give me a snapshot into some, quintessential blues sounding music. This pretty much this whole album is what that is, as far
Now,
as I'm concerned.
well, and I would say there isn't a ton of variation
Right.
between the tracks. So it does get a little samey at times. There are breaks of it, like Blue Feeling, right, is a different feel altogether early. But for a lot of it, it's the same template, and especially a band that is dipping their toes into making a full length album. And I listened to this album a couple times, Matt. I listened to it one time all the way through, and then I listened to it a couple times in just bits and pieces. And I will tell you, in the bits and pieces, I enjoyed it even more because
Yeah.
what happens is you really appreciate the small nuances when you listen to it in bits and pieces, as opposed to in album form. And that's how I would describe this. This is as much a collection of singles or a live show, right? More so than it is an album with a concept to it.
Oh
And
yeah.
that's not altogether unusual, period, in this day. Like with the Supremes, right? I got the same feeling that
Right.
you could listen to this as just ripping off a bunch of singles or individual songs, but when taken as sort of a 12 to 15 track compilation, it it's not so much that it becomes worse, it loses a little bit of
Yes.
something because it wasn't in many ways, I think, designed to be an album in the way that we would come to know an album later.
Right. And you can't fault it for that because it was just, first of all, a product of its time. But I also
Hmm.
think that's an interesting aspect of just albums in general, because I think that going back to talking about the Byrds Younger Than Yesterday, I think one of the things that we talked about liking about it is that it's so varied, right? If you
Hmm.
don't like one type of song, you just wait, the next song will kick in and it'll change it
Absolutely.
up a bit. So I think that that's something to be applauded in a lot of senses. But and something like this that's kind of straight through, because I agree with you, it's samey, and that's an interesting point that you bring up. That if you maybe put a couple of tracks on a mix or something like that, or you listen to a little here, a little there, you'll get more out of it. But I also think that there's certain people that if this is your thing,
Hmm.
you're gonna like I think you're gonna like it, because I know that there's certain albums and certain artists that I like that I could see people saying, well, it all sounds the same. It's just one. It's good. But if you like that sound, if you like that structure, or whatever it is about that, and you're okay listening to a lot of that, which I think that that's true for me with certain albums and certain
Sure. Yep.
artists, that I think that this is going to really scratch that itch for you, and you're going to love it. So I can appreciate that as well. I think probably for me it is a little bit too samey, but I
Okay.
also think that, but I never really, like I said, other than that song, I'm mad again. I didn't
Hmm.
really find myself going, I'm done with this. You know what I mean? So it still held my attention, I think, for that 40 minutes or whatever that
Well,
it lasts.
and I would agree. I enjoyed this album thoroughly. The sameness did not necessarily get in the way of me enjoying it because, as Matt said earlier, it is a tight album,
Yeah,
and you
they're
can
good
see why
musicians.
musicians like it. Yeah, it's there isn't necessarily in the way that we've talked about in other albums, or just even as we will talk about in other albums, standout performers or people that's like, oh, here's where the sound comes from at this point. Or things that, and this is where you can listen to this keyboardist who's transcendent, right? Or this drummer doing fills, like a Keith Moon or a John Bonham type character, right? In this, everybody is a professional musician, almost to the point of like how those session players sound on some of the albums that we've covered. And Eric Burdon's voice is raw and
Yeah.
opens up and expressive. And unlike the Stones, who I've always said I love because they do blues, but younger Stones and a little bit later Stones, like Let It Bleed and Sticky Fingers and Exile Stones, right? When they're really sleazy, they're just this sleazy sound, right? In a good way.
Yeah.
Early Stones, a little bit more polished, but definitely taking it in an R&B direction. So a little bit more like the kids smoking behind the school compared to the Beatles, right? This, on the other hand, takes the Stones version and makes it darker. And that's what I kind of liked about this. The vibe of this the organ, the songwriting, and the up and down. I mean, Eric Burdon. Say what you want about Mick Jagger, and I love the Stones. I love Mick Jagger, but Eric Burdon's a considerably better blues singer in the traditional sense, right? In that church version, opened up version of singing than maybe a Mick Jagger is, and I think that gives this a little bit of more polish, but also they managed to be polished but with edge in it,
Yeah.
which is a rare thing that you don't see very often, because you can be studio slick or a little bit jagged, but to be able to pull both off, especially in 1964,
Yeah.
right? That's what really stayed with me on this one, and you can see why musicians and just really love this album because of walking that line. Is
Yeah.
what I would say.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
no, it was. I would recommend it, and I think. Did you look at their Wikipedia page? It's amazing how many members they're still around. I guess, right? Are they still
I
technically
think they
a band?
do. Yeah,
but
they
it's not
do
any
play,
of the
but
original
right,
guys, right? It's all these.
right.
But the lineup, the former members, there must be 30 people on here. Like, but their last studio album was released in 1983, so I guess they just tour. But I found that to be really interesting that it's technically still a band.
But you start to see that a lot with 60s bands and also singing groups. I haven't ever looked, but I could only imagine what the Four Tops version would be, because there's been about
Yeah,
500 Four Tops, right?
Right.
You know what I mean, in different spots. And I think that's just the nature of the beast, right? Some people don't want to be a nostalgia act. Some people die early. Some people have falling outs because of songwriting credits, right? So, as a result, if you want to keep playing, and it seems like for a lot of artists, there's always a period, no matter how disillusioned they are, that they go back and do that reunion tour, right? It's rare that you see a group just say, yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah.
In terms of reuniting. So it must be tough, because you probably have fond memories of these songs, and also there's you're playing later in your life to people that have more disposable income who enjoys your music, right?
Heck
So,
yeah. Hey, I was
surprising.
supposed to go see Poison and Motley Crue and all those guys, but then COVID happened, so they took my money. So
Well, I don't know whether to tell you that was a bad thing or whether to tell you that you dodged a bullet. So
yeah, well, they're coming back next summer, so we could talk about it then, when we're probably somewhere deep in the beginning of the 80s, maybe.
I don't think they're going to be anywhere near the top 100, but that's
No,
good. But there might be a
so.
bonus episode that you'll be able to introduce Poison.
A little hair metal,
but we can save that for another time in another place. But from what I'm gathering, Matt, easy thumbs up and recommend for me. Would you say the same for you?
Yeah, I'd agree. I don't think that there's many people that. I mean, if you like rock and roll, I don't see how you aren't going to like this. I can see maybe some people maybe getting a little too bogged down in that sameness that you were talking about, or maybe wanting a little bit more, I don't know, modern sounds, than this has. But overall, I think for most people, it's a pretty easy listen. It's good. They're really good.
If you do need a lot of novelty and you're worried about that sameness, listen to it in 3-track bursts, and
right.
you'll enjoy it a great deal. Like Matt said, I find it hard to believe there's going to be people who wouldn't like that album. So good choice, Dad. Good musical influence to start with.
Your dad knows a little what's up, so that's good. So much more than my dad. I love my dad, but